So welcome everybody to the RAAC training series. Again, I'm Sadie Everett, and we kicked off the RAAC training series in the fall, and all of the trainings fell under the umbrella of supporting mental health and well-being. And this fall, I wanted to try something a little different. So I wanted to do mini series and then do it, getting a little deeper dive into a topic. So this mini series is about compassionate interventions to support engagement and learning. And we kicked the series off with Dr. Kate Doyle on sharing evidence-based practices to support engagement. And then Christy Carnahan, she also did a training on evidence-based practices supporting self-regulation. And Dr. Alyssa Henry, also UC faculty, is here to present on evidence-based practices to support reading comprehension. So I will stop talking and hand it over to Alyssa, and she can get started. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Sadie. So as she mentioned, my name is Alyssa Henry. I'm a faculty member at UC, and I've spent probably the past 10 to 15 years working with teachers and parents, mainly of children with autism, focusing on reading and language. And so, I have a wide range of strategies to work with lots of different types of learners. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more broadly today, but then we'll, touch on some things that you can do to kind of expand or simplify based on the learners that you're working with. And, I'm mainly going to be talking sort of to teachers today, but then I'll also touch on some things that can be helpful if you're a parent and are thinking about how you want to work with your kid at home. So let me share my screen here. And I want to play. Okay. And can everyone see that? Yes.
Looks
all right.
good.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about evidence-based practices to support reading comprehension. And like I said, I'm going to be kind of doing a wide range of things. This is sort of a broad approach to what you can do. But then I'm happy, since we are a small group, I'm happy at the end to talk about some specifics. If you have a student that you're really concerned about or something that's going on, happy to chat about that. So today we're going to be just doing a very brief overview of reading comprehension. If, most of you are teachers, you probably know all about reading comprehension, but just anchoring us there, and then talking about some strategies for before, during, and after reading. And then we're going to end with a wrap up and answering any questions. So why do we need to support reading comprehension? Many of you probably know the answer, but it's because comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading. When we engage with a text, we are trying to learn something. We're trying to, do a deep dive into the world that the author has created. We're trying to, engage with the textbook for school, but ultimately we're trying to understand what we read. And skilled readers do more than decode the words on the page. They are extracting meaning as they read in order to comprehend what they read. So when we're supporting reading, we always want to keep that larger goal of comprehension in mind. I think it's easy to get caught up in some of the little things like, let's sound out this word. Here's a vocabulary word. What does that mean? And sometimes we have so many little things going on that we forget about that larger goal, which is, are we understanding what we're reading or what we're listening to somebody else read? If you work with reading in your classroom, you're probably familiar with the simple view of reading. So the simple view of reading posits that reading comprehension is the product of two components. So first we have that decoding or word recognition piece, which is just, can you read the words on the page? And then we have linguistic comprehension or language comprehension. And again, both of these make up reading comprehension. Now, the simple view of reading, however, despite its name, is not quite so simple, because each of these pieces is made up of subcomponents. So in this decoding piece, we have word knowledge and spelling or encoding. We think about things like phonological awareness, the ability to hear and manipulate sounds and words, alphabet knowledge, orthography, which is that spelling piece. So all of these things are making up that decoding piece. Then we also have linguistic comprehension, which is made up of vocabulary knowledge, knowledge of language structure, which includes pragmatics, semantics, syntax, and then we have background knowledge. And these two pieces, if we think about our readers and we think about these two pieces, decoding and linguistic comprehension, then we can create profiles of readers who have strengths and weaknesses in these two skills. So you can see on the horizontal axis here, we have word recognition, and then the vertical, we have language comprehension. And so if we're thinking about students who struggle with that word recognition piece, so they're struggling to read the words on the page, but actually they're doing pretty well with that language comprehension piece, we would call those students poor decoders, or sometimes we say, they have dyslexia or specific reading disability. And then, of course, on the other side, I saw somebody brought it up in the chat, we have hyperlexia. And so these are our students who they can, read the words on the page just fine, but they're not really understanding what they read. There's something going on with that language comprehension piece that is impeding their ability to comprehend. And then we have what we sometimes call our garden variety poor readers. So these are students who are struggling with both. They're struggling with decoding, and then they're also struggling with language comprehension. And then, of course, we have our good readers who are doing just fine across the board. When we're talking about students with autism, we often want to focus on this bottom piece, so this language comprehension piece. And the reason why is because research shows that 68% of readers with autism show some level of difficulty with reading comprehension. Now, this could mean that they have what we call hyperlexia, so they're struggling with language comprehension, not so much with decoding, or they might be struggling with both. But either way, that language comprehension piece, something's going on there that's making it difficult for them to engage in that language comprehension, that oral language. And so that is why today, as I'm discussing these different components, I'm focusing on that language comprehension piece. And this isn't to say that the decoding piece isn't important. Of course it is. We always want to make sure that we are focusing on decoding, but for our learners with autism, this linguistic comprehension piece is really important, and sometimes it's not focused on quite as much as it should be.
Hey, Alyssa, can you show that statistic one more time? Somebody asked in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks.
And I will just say, so this statistic is from a study that I was involved in, where we looked at over 400 adolescents, so older children and adolescents with autism. And so this is real data that I helped collect. And so, that's where we got that number from. And please, Sadie will direct me if you do have questions or you want me to stop and go back, happy to do so. So again, as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about that linguistic comprehension piece. And so when we are thinking about supporting linguistic comprehension in service of reading comprehension, there are things that we want to do before, during, and after reading. Before reading is sometimes what I call the most important piece. And that's not to say, all three pieces are important, but I think sometimes we forget about all of the different things that go into reading a book and how we want to set up for success to make sure that the students that we're engaging with understand what they're reading. The number one thing is text selection. We want to think about what the book, and that could include things like the genre of the book, the language structure of the book, the topic of the book. So there's lots of things that the book is bringing to the table. And then the child is also bringing some things to the table, what they're interested in, their cognitive and language skills, their ability to understand the different language structures. So we want to keep all of these things in mind when we're selecting a book to read. Again, that background knowledge piece is really important. What does the child already know? What do they not know? Where are the gaps? Text structure, how difficult is the text? Is it an informational text? Is it a fictional text? Are there tricky things that are happening with the text that make the language structure difficult to understand? And then, as I said, the genre and the interest. We know a lot of children with autism have topics that they're really interested in. And so you may find more success in a book that, is a topic that they're really interested in, as opposed to they're, trying to engage with the topic that maybe is not quite so interesting to them. So thinking about this simple view of reading again, we are going to talk about background knowledge first in this before reading activities. So the first thing that we want to do is build and activate background knowledge. We want to focus on stumbling blocks. So is there something in the book, maybe the topic, the culture that's being represented in the book, maybe the historical context? Is there something that's going to be unfamiliar to the student in that book? And then if there is something that's unfamiliar, we want to build knowledge in an authentic way. And there's lots of different ways to do this. So for example, if you are reading a historical fiction book, maybe you want to pair that with an easy nonfiction book. Here's an example from the Magic Treehouse series. For a while, I don't think they do this anymore. Magic Treehouse would put out these fact books that you could pair with the chapter books. And so you can read more about that historical context and see pictures and learn facts as you're reading that fictional text. You can also watch YouTube videos that can help you build that knowledge. If, field trips is a little bit more of a heavy lift, but if you are going on a field trip somewhere, maybe think about bringing in a text that helps you leverage the knowledge that you're building on that field trip. And then there's usually in historical fiction books and sometimes science books, there's going to be resources that are provided by the author themselves. So notes, maps, recipes. Here's an example from Little House on the Prairie. They usually show some sort of recipe. The characters in the story are creating that cookie recipe, and then you can do the same thing at home. When you're thinking about building and activating knowledge, you want to make sure that the knowledge that you are trying to build is related to the deeper meaning of the story. So for example, if you are reading Rainbow Fish, that book takes place in the ocean. However, the larger themes of the book are really focused on, the concepts of friendship, of generosity. And so it really wouldn't be worth your time to talk about the different creatures that you might find in the sea, like fish and octopuses. Because that knowledge isn't really related to what's happening in the story. Instead, it would probably make more sense to build background knowledge on those concepts of friendship, of, selfishness, of generosity. On the other hand, though, sometimes it is appropriate to talk about those, facts that are related to the setting. For example, if you were reading Little House on the Prairie, it may be really important to learn about pioneer life in the American Midwest because the book is going to be focused on themes like self-reliance, on struggle, and it's important for students to understand why that life was such a struggle, to kind of understand what the characters are thinking and feeling in the book. We also, especially for our learners on the spectrum, we want to make sure that we don't forget social background knowledge. Especially when we're reading fictional books, there are going to be interactions between characters, feelings, different social themes that are going to come up. For example, in a story, you may have two characters that are fighting about something, or maybe you'll have a older brother who's upset about, his new little sister. And so these are social themes that we want to talk about before we read that story. Is there ever a time where you felt that way? How did that feel like? What were you thinking when you felt that? When we're building that social background knowledge, we want to find real life examples whenever possible. If you're reading a story about a character who's starting school, you could ask a question like, have you ever been nervous about starting something new, without your mom or your dad or your grandma? But when you can't find a real life example, you can always make connections to movies and TV shows that the child enjoys. And then, you can always connect to other books read in the classroom because you know that the student has engaged with those books before. And I just showed here on the right side, this is a knowledge activation activity that you can do that just has a little prompt. In this case, it says, this is from Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. And, this prompt asks what a bad day looks like. This child has chosen to draw, a frowny face. They're upset about their bad day. You also might have a child who draws, some things that happen on a bad day. But that's helping us activate that knowledge of, oh, what does a bad day look like? How did that feel? Which helps you understand how the main character is feeling in that story. And, if we're talking about emotions, we want to make sure that the students that we're working with know the emotion that we are discussing. These examples here are just some picture books that are usually more appropriate for our younger learners. But if we're talking about, if the book that you have selected talks about one of these emotions, it can be helpful to use these other stories to build some background knowledge. And it helps us also understand some of the words that an author might use to describe the emotion. For example, when an author talks about anger, usually they say things like, oh, she clenched her fists or her face got all red. And so they're describing with their words how that emotion feels, which is different than being able to look at somebody's face and recognize that they're angry. And so these books can help give you some of the language that the authors might use to talk about that emotion, which will be really helpful when you're engaging in your target text. So we just talked about background knowledge, but then before we read, we also want to think about language structure. And there's a lot of different interesting things that authors do with language in stories. Again, these are just some picture book examples of a few ways that authors tend to kind of play with language a little bit. A lot of children's books focus on figurative language or hyperbole. This example here on the left is a book called Pigsty, which is about a boy whose room is so messy that a bunch of pigs come and live in it. And so, to understand that story, you have to understand the idea of a metaphor, of the fact that, the boy's room is messy, and so the pigs appear, but in real life, pigs don't really appear in your room. And so, that can be kind of tricky when we're working with our learners on the spectrum. A lot of times books will also include flashbacks or memories. And so that temporal shift can be really tricky if you're not expecting it. And so paying attention to the language that they're using, present tense, past tense, what they're doing to indicate that temporal shift can be really helpful when we are trying to make sense of that language structure. And then the final example that I have here is different perspectives or shifting point of view. This example here is the true story of the Three Little Pigs, which is the three little pigs told from the wolf's perspective. And so that can be kind of tricky, especially if your students are familiar with the story of the Three Little Pigs, to understand those different perspectives. And so, this isn't to say that you should avoid books that have tricky things going on with the language, but I think you just want to pay extra attention to it. In fact, it can be really helpful to engage with these books because then it helps students learn some of these different types of language structure. But you just want to pay extra attention to it and notice that, students with autism may have a harder time with some of these different pieces. And so the last thing that I want to touch on is vocabulary. We always don't want to forget about vocabulary. Um, my rule of thumb is to always teach high utility words. So 1 to 3 high utility words before I read a story. And what I mean by high utility words is words that are essential to understanding the main idea of a text. So I'm not going to be able to understand this story if I don't know what this word means. And another part of a high utility word is a word that's frequently encountered across contexts. So you don't want to be focusing on a word that's pretty fringe, that they're not going to hear again in other contexts. You want words that are going to come up again and again. And of course, you want a word that your student doesn't already know. So this is an example of a word that I might use with a younger child or a child with potentially complex communication needs. So in this story, it takes place in a store. And so I would want to make sure that students know what that is. And this can be really quick. This is the word store. A store is where you go to buy things you need, and then you just move on. So this vocabulary instruction doesn't have to be really long. But it just helps make sure that you are building that knowledge before you move into reading. And then the final thing that I always do before I read a book is to ask a guiding question to set a purpose for reading. And it's really important to set a purpose for reading because it helps give students a task to do, which can keep them focused and engaged. If you are working on a particular comprehension strategy in your classroom, then usually you're going to want that guiding question to be related to that comprehension strategy. So for example, if in your class you're learning about story retelling, learning about how a story has main characters and a beginning, a middle, and an end, then I might ask a question like, who is the main character? Or what happens at the end of the story? So again, it's related back to the things that they're already learning, rather than just kind of a random question that isn't related to any larger context. So that was a lot of information about before. Like I said, I think it just goes to show that there's a lot of things that you want to think about before you're reading a book. But then, of course, we have our during. So you know what to do when we are reading. And so, there's a couple of different ways that you can read, right? We have independent reading and then we have read alouds. So if I am conducting a read aloud, so I'm reading aloud to my students, then I want to do a couple of things during reading to support comprehension. The first is think aloud modeling, which is just you kind of talking through your thinking processes out loud. There's an example on the right here. So if I saw, 2 friends in a story that were fighting about something, I might say, oh, it seems like these 2 characters are fighting. I wonder what will happen next. I know when my friend and I fight, I have to make sure that I apologize to her so that she can forgive me and then we can be friends again. So you're kind of narrating your thinking process to help students learn about, what that comprehension process looks like, thinking about what the text is saying, what's in your background knowledge, and how you can use that information to make predictions or to comprehend the story. And then we also want to ask open-ended questions. And the reason why we want the questions to be open-ended is because we want to provide students with an opportunity to, answer questions maybe in an interesting way, or in a way we haven't thought about before. If you are finding that you're asking open-ended questions and your students are giving you nothing or they're not giving you the right answer, then you can, move to more closed-ended questions, which are yes or no questions, either or. But I always like to start with open-ended questions and then winnow down as needed to give students the opportunity to respond. The most important thing that happens during reading is the continuity with any before reading activities. So you want to support and reinforce the use of the target comprehension strategy if you have one. You want to reinforce the story vocabulary. So when you encounter that high utility vocabulary word in the story, you just want to say, hey, here's our vocabulary word. Remember, this is what it means. And then you also want to remind the students of the guiding question when applicable. If the answer to the guiding question is on a page, or maybe there's a clue to the answer to the guiding question that's on a page. I always like to say, and remember, we're thinking about our guiding question. Who is the main character in the story? I'm seeing that this character is showing up a lot, something like that. Reminding students of the purpose that we set for reading. Now, this process looks a little different if you have students that are engaging in independent reading, because if a reader is reading silently, then we don't necessarily know when to stop or to ask them questions. And so for our independent readers, we want to make sure that we're focusing on metacognition, which is that idea that you are able to think about your thinking. And so we want to teach students to be able to self-monitor their comprehension. We want them to be aware of when they do or do not understand. Okay, am I understanding what I'm reading here? If I'm not understanding what I'm reading, what can I do? What kind of fix-up strategy can I use to help me make sure that I understand what I'm reading? And the best way to do this is with checklists or with graphic organizers that you can have students fill out. This is an example. Sharon Vaughn at UT Austin has a program called Collaborative Strategic Reading, which is really excellent, and there's evidence for using it with learners with autism, so it's always one that I like to point out. On the right here, you can see an example of a CSR learning log, and there's procedures before, during, and after reading. In that during reading section, we are asking readers to find quote unquote clunks. So the areas, some words that they might struggle with, and then adding in the definition of that word. And then it also asks students to look at each section and to find the gist or the main idea, which helps them make sure that they're understanding what they read as they move along. And so, you don't have to use this exact graphic organizer. There are some that are a little bit more simpler and some that are more complex. But having something that a student can check or fill out as they go along can really help with that independent reading process. When we are reading, I want to just make us, I just want to touch on the theme of this series, which is compassionate intervention. And reading really should be fun. We want to build space for discussion based on student initiations. A lot of times we'll have students who are really excited about one part of the story. Maybe there's a character making a funny face on the page. Maybe something really silly happens in that part of the story. And it's okay to spend some time building space for that engagement, for that enjoyment. Of course, we don't want to spend too much time on it, but we don't necessarily have to move students along too quickly, especially if they're showing that they're really enjoying whatever part of the book we're reading. Responsive language is also really important for high quality interactions. And so, I always just try to follow the child's lead, comment on what the child is seeing, request additional information, and then bring it back to comprehension if I can. Oh, I see you really like what that character's doing. Yeah, he's making a really funny face. What do you think he's thinking about? Oh, yeah, his brother in the story is really annoying him, et cetera, et cetera. So try to bring it back to that comprehension piece, but still acknowledge that, yeah, that is kind of a funny page and it's okay to enjoy it. So that was, again, we've gone through the before, the during processes, and now we're in this after piece. So what should we do after we've read the book or after the student that we're working with has read the book? Well, the first thing that we want to do is, of course, review that guiding question. So remember, we've set a purpose for reading, we've asked a question, and now we're going to want to go back to it and, ask students to share their answers to that question. When we ask the guiding question, we want to think about what answers will be accepted. Sometimes there's only one answer that's going to be right, and other times it might be a little bit more of an open-ended question that can have multiple answers. And that's going to help us scaffold the responses. This is an example from an intervention study that I conducted with third grade students who had intellectual disability. And this question is for the book Julius. And you can see that this question was, what did Julius do in the store? And there's only one answer to this question. Julius tried on clothes. And so I have a procedure that I use when I'm working with students to help scaffold their answers if they can't come up with it right off the top of their head. And so this is a least to most prompting hierarchy, and I call it ARCs. And so the first one, A, ask the guiding question, and then R, reread the page, and then the sentence if needed. So here in the book Julius, the answer can be found on page 16. The Julius who sneaked into stores with her and tried on clothes. So the answer is right there. So I would reread the page, see if the student could answer, and then if not, I would reread the sentence. And if the student is still not able to answer, that's when I would provide a choice. Did Julius try on clothes or did he eat cake? And then finally, we have our most intensive scaffold, which is to provide a sentence stem. In the store, Julius tried on blank. And so this is the prompting hierarchy that I use. You can use one that works for you, but I think it's important to just think about, if the student is not able to answer that guiding question, how can we kind of gently lead them to the answer before just asking them to kind of repeat what the answer is. And this example that I provided here is a pretty simple guiding question. Sometimes if you're working with more complex text, the guiding question can be a lot more complicated, and then the answers would also be more complicated. We also want to think about extension activities after reading. If you're a parent, you may not have time to do all of these different activities, but if you're teaching in a classroom and you've just read a book, then usually I extend it with some sort of written expression activity. And I say written expression because it doesn't necessarily have to be formal writing. So, they don't have to answer a prompt with writing or write an essay or a story. They can also maybe draw something. They can complete graphic organizers. So there's different ways to engage in that written expression. Sometimes, too, it may be more appropriate to just engage in discussion, either with the teacher, with a parent, or even better, if you're able to have peers interact with one another about the story, share what they learned from the story, what they thought about the story. That's really wonderful because it helps bring in that social communication piece as well. And I just want us to remember that the goal for these extension activities is to support comprehension of text. And so I want to just caution you against doing activities maybe like a coloring page or a creative writing prompt that really doesn't have anything to do with comprehension of the story, just because that's not really in service of that larger goal, which is comprehension. And so I just wanted to show some examples of some graphic organizers that I have used. And this first one here is for story mapping. So you may have heard it called story grammar. So that idea that we're able to say who the characters are in the story, where the story takes place, the setting, and then what happens in the story. What happens in the beginning, middle, and end of the story. What is the main character's problem, and how do they find a solution to that problem? So all of that goes into story mapping. When I'm working with either younger students or students with complex communication needs, I might use a very simple story mapping graphic organizer like this one. So this just says who's in the story, where the story takes place, what the problem is, and then how do they fix the problem. And here, this is an example from the book Knuffle Bunny. And I've just taken direct kind of pictures or screenshots from the story. and put them in the various boxes. And this really helps students lock in to who it is that we're talking about because they look just like they do in the story. So in this example, we have 3 characters that we're focusing on. The story takes place in a laundromat. It's sometimes hard to find pictures for the problem and the solution, but you can usually find something that works. In this example, the problem is that the little girl in the story, her favorite stuffed animal, Nuffle Bunny, is taking a wash in the laundromat, the washing machine, and she's pretty upset about it. And then the way that they fix the problem is at the end they take Nuffle Bunny out of the washing machine, and she's very excited. And so all of this is included here with pictures. Now, of course, there are ways to build on this and add a little bit more detail. This is an example of a narrative plot diagram that still uses pictures, but they're not necessarily kind of screenshots straight from the story. If you look on the left too, this is also an example of some definitions that might be helpful when you're teaching story mapping. What does the word characters mean? What kinds of things might the characters be feeling? What does the setting mean? And then, like I said, on the right, we have those pictures of what might be happening in the story. So these are very simple images, but they can help us talk about what goes on in the story and help us retell it to somebody else.
Alyssa, just a question in the chat about, can you share these? I figured you don't mind if I share the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll share the recording as well. Do you have separate files for the actual graphic organizers?
Yeah, I do. So I can definitely share. Some of these are from interventions that I have created and run. And so I'll share any of those materials that I have, I'll share.
Great.
And then other ones are just ones that you can find online.
Sure.
Or, you'll see people have created themselves. But that's an excellent question, and I'm more than happy to share.
Great. Thanks.
So like I said, these are a little bit more simple, but we can definitely ramp it up. So this is an example of a story pyramid from Reading Quest, which is just asking you to use words to describe the characters, the setting, what happens in the story. I really like a story pyramid because it's asking you to pick just one word, which can be tricky, but can also really help you narrow in on what the important parts are of the story. On the right, we have a story map that, again, asks us who the main character and the setting are, but instead of just that simple problem fix, now we have what's the main character's problem, what happens in the story, how do they solve the problem, and then what's the outcome. So this is just taking that first one that I showed you at the beginning and making it a little bit more complex. And these are just a couple of examples. On the left here, this is something that you can make easily on your own. This is from the book Miss Nelson is Missing. And on the right, I wanted to just show an example from Shakespeare. Any of you who have read Shakespeare or taught Shakespeare know that the hardest part about it is figuring out who's in the story, and we're trying to remember all of their names and how they're related to each other. So this is an example of a high schooler who has mapped out Romeo and Juliet, the different characters, and then how they're related to each other. So if you do have students who are maybe in general ed settings and are engaging with these more complex texts, this is just an example of how you could really expand it and take that piece that we've been talking about and make it a little bit more complex. So that was story mapping. Another graphic organizer, and in the chat, people talked about, somebody talked about making connections. This is really hard a lot of times for students on the spectrum. And that's because, it's sometimes hard for them to think about what others are thinking, what they're feeling. And that can sometimes extend to what the characters in the story are thinking and feeling. And so I like to use these graphic organizers, and I'll share them with you, just to help us really think about what the characters are feeling in the story. And so this is an example again from Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. I probably should have picked a different story that didn't have quite a long title that I have to keep repeating. But in that story, Alexander has a lot of things that happen to him that make his day bad. And so this graphic organizer just has a prompt that says, what happens that made Alexander's day so bad? And then there is a figure, an outline of a person with Alexander. And so then this child has written, brother pushed Alexander in the mud. But it's really helping us put that right onto the character. This is what happened to the character in the story. So it's taking that idea and making it really tangible. This is another example of a student who is not yet able to write. So their answer to this they did through drawing. So they drew Alexander stepping on his skateboard. They drew Alexander stuck in the back seat of the car in the middle seat. And then they also drew a frowny face of Alexander not being happy about his bad day. And so when we look at what happened to the character in the story, we can make a direct comparison to ourselves. And so what I like to do is what I've shown on this graphic organizer here. So we have on one side the character in the story, on the other side is the self, so the student themselves. And so you can see here, this student has written what happened on Alexander's bad day and then how it made him feel. And then what happened on their bad day. Their socks got wet, they got a bad grade, and it made them feel bad and sad. And so this allows us to make, again, that direct comparison to what the student is feeling and then what the character is feeling in the story. And then here I've just included another short writing prompt of, you've had a bad day. What do you do to feel better? To really just sort of extend that piece and think about, what I feel and what I'm thinking and how that relates to the character. Here's another example of an extension activity. If you've read Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, you know that Alexander spends most of the story kind of upset and crabby. And so this prompt says, Alexander had a bad day and it just kept getting worse. Maybe next time he could try making himself feel better. And let's write a letter to him. So the student on the left has said, oh, sometimes I have a bad day, but I count to 10. Maybe you could try that next time too. And then on the right, they've said, I have a bad day, but I make myself feel better by playing video games. They make me feel happy. So again, really allowing students to dig into what they have felt in a similar situation and how they can relate that directly back to the character in the story. And ultimately, that helps with comprehension because it helps us understand what the characters in the story are thinking, what they're feeling, and why they're reacting the way that they are in the story. If I have any parents in the audience, you may be saying to yourself, okay, I may not necessarily have time to be pulling out all these graphic organizers, but you don't necessarily need to do that. I really like to use visual supports just to have that brief conversation about emotions, emotion wheels, emotion charts. Other books like Today I Feel Silly are ways to have that quick conversation of, what do you think the characters in the story is feeling? Here's what that looks like. And just touch on that conversation without necessarily having to do a big involved graphic organizer. So in conclusion, by providing instruction in oral language and listening comprehension, that linguistic comprehension piece of the simple view of reading, you can have an impact on students' reading comprehension. And we want to, before reading, during reading, and after reading, focus on language or social pieces of the story that might be particularly difficult for your student. And then we want to make sure that we're supporting before, during, and after reading. And also make sure that we're thinking about visual supports and graphic organizers, which are really key when we're working with learners with autism, and really thinking about how we can support their comprehension. And that's it. I am open for questions. Please ask them out loud or put them in the chat. And I'll put this up too while we're waiting.
I don't have a question, but it made me so nostalgic for, well, I taught 2nd grade, if you can believe that, feels like in another life. So I miss this. I missed all that, and my boys are too big for this kind of stuff anymore to be read to, and
Yep,
yeah,
yep. And I
yep.
know, a lot of the
But I miss it.
yeah, and a lot of the examples that I shared today were picture books, but all of these things can be extended into, of course, chapter books,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. It's just sometimes easier to talk about things when we have, pictures that are involved. And some of this stuff is just a little bit trickier when you're working with older students, but usually the process is the same. You just have to chunk things up a little bit differently.
Great.
And I just want to make sure that I touched on everybody's questions at the beginning. I think I did. Somebody asked about behaviors and dysregulation. I just wanted to say that there's a couple of different reasons why we see that when we're reading. Sometimes it's because um, there's a lot, if we have a student who's struggling with language, there's a lot of language that is being thrown at students when, especially if we're reading a story out loud. And so that can be really difficult. And sometimes we may see some behaviors or dysregulation. And so pausing and asking questions, graphic organizers are all ways to kind of break up that language a little bit so it's not quite so overwhelming. And then sometimes, we may just have students who are like, this story's boring and I don't like it. So we want to make sure that we are also including books that are fun, that, maybe there's a topic that the student's interested in. Maybe there's some funny pictures, funny stories. So keeping a balance so that we see a little bit less of that dysregulation. Sometimes there's not that much that we can do, but those are the two things that I see pretty commonly that have some easy fixes.
There's a question here. Would the use of Reader's Theater, oh gosh, I used to love Reader's Theater. Reader's Theater work using these strategies for older students?
Yeah, Reader's Theater is great. I think the one thing that Reader's Theater does not do is really think about the needs of this population. So like I said, that before reading piece is probably going to be really important if you are using Reader's Theater. But anything that's multimodal, so, those visual supports, but Reader's Theater being able to act out the story and stuff like that, we find that can be really, really helpful for some of these students. And as you mentioned, can work really well for older students.
And what about audiobooks? Would you
I think,
recommend that as a
yeah,
supplement or?
Yeah, I think it depends on the child. I think if you are going the audiobook route, I like to pair it with written text whenever
Mhm.
possible. Anybody on here who has listened to an audiobook or a podcast knows that all of a sudden, if you're driving, all of a sudden you're like, what's happening in this? You've just lost it. So that is the kind of the danger with audiobooks. But if you pair it with written text, that can be really helpful. Or if you just kind of pause it enough to make sure that you are doing those comprehension checks, that's another good way. But that's a really good point too, because we want to make sure that we're working on comprehension, even if we have students who are struggling with decoding or with reading fluency. And so sometimes in the classroom, while we're working on those skills, we still want to be thinking about language comprehension. And so reading out loud or audiobooks are really good ways to do that. Because we still want to be bolstering those skills alongside that decoding and that fluency piece. Okay, well, I don't think I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions. Like Sadie said, I will share those graphic organizers that I have developed, and I'll upload those so you can have access to those. And then, of course, you'll have access to my slides as well.
Great. Thank you so much. And I also just put in a link to a very brief survey. Um, as we keep doing this, I'm just collecting feedback. I just want to improve where we can and provide. Also, if you're interested in getting CEUs for this training, I can send you a certificate. So there's a question about that as well. And I'll be emailing and then again the survey, the presentation, and the recording of this training in a day or two. And also stay tuned for the next topic of our training series. I'm still working on it. I'm looking at end of April and May to do another 2 to 3 session mini series on a hot topic. So stay tuned for that. But thanks everybody. Thanks so much, Alyssa. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks everybody.